is changing the life of every one of us, and especially in the future of our work and employment sector. My name is Alessandro. I am the managing director of U40, and I'm very happy to have here with us such an distinguished panel. A lot of great panelists. We have Svetlana Penkova, member of the European Parliament from Bulgaria. Hi, Svetlana. We have Sukti Dasgupta, who is Chief of Employment at the International Labour Organization. Thank you, Sukti, for joining us. Kasper Kling, who is a former diplomat and the new Vice President at Microsoft. So thank you, Kasper, for being here. And then we have Thanos Mosiadis, who is working from Uber for the European team. So thank you all for being here. I think it's very interesting that we are able to put together such a panel that includes both the politics, the policy, and then, of course, the industry. We are going to discuss today how the future of work will look like. To give a bit of context, a recent study has shown that in April 2020, after the pandemic, youth unemployment has risen to almost 16%, and global unemployment in like the overall unemployment in Europe has almost reached the 7%. So we are really at a level where we need to do something. A lot of dynamics have changed. A lot of things that we have given as an assumption have changed. So I would start with Svetlana. Svetlana, as a member of the European Parliament, as a young, European as well, what is your take on this? How is the way forward, and how can we really make sure that we have an exit strategy from an economic point of view, but also from a social point of view for our workers in Europe?
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you for organizing this debate. I think it's a really good time to have this conversation now, because I believe that most of the European countries managed to tackle the health crisis we've been observing with the start of the pandemic, but inevitably now we're facing an economic crisis, which is resulting in everything you've described in terms of unemployment and the new ways of work, and which basically reflects how the new labor market and the structure should be basically changed and updated to the current requirements. So I will start with a few points. So definitely, it's been inevitably proven during the crisis the importance of digitalization and new technologies, because the modern way of work basically save certain aspects of the economy. It's pointless to give examples because I'm pretty sure we're all familiar in terms of e-commerce, working from home, and everything that's been made possible with the digitalization and the new technology. Important thing is, like, we should be adapting to that together with updating the educational system where it's necessary and providing the necessary training for the employees. But we should not undermine the social aspects and the changes that will be reflected in that. So in my short expose, I'll point out to 4 important areas I believe are important for all the speakers, and I'm sure they're going to be a matter of discussion. The first thing is that the European digital agenda must have a social aspect. We shouldn't be ignoring the social and employment benefits that should be available to all the workers. Decent working conditions, professional training, and employee benefits should be on the top of our agenda when we're developing the digital strategy for the future, as it's going to be definitely a part of the future development. The second point, which has been quite active in the European space of discussion now, is the minimum wage. If we need that, how it should be implemented, because we need to grant fair working conditions for all the platform workers. The discussion now is also being twisted in a way to having different minimum wages for different industries. And I think we should be discussing that quite actively with the industries themselves as well. The third one is we need adequate social security for self-employed workers, because they're also a big part of that new way of working, and especially the digital labor market. An example I would like to point out is something we should be thinking about in the future is the proposal for the European Social Security number, which would help the national authorities to follow the benefits, the pension schemes in the workers when we are still quite actively moving around the EU, because the closing of the borders and the restrictions were definitely a temporary condition. So this is another aspect we should also be addressing and thinking about for the future, because that's going to make the system much easier and would also be beneficial for the labor market. And the fourth point I would like to raise, which is also related to the new technologies, is, and it shouldn't be ignored, is the digitalization of public services. Because that's going to make it easier for the employees to follow their benefits. It's going to make it easier for all of us to have access to our rights and the regulations all across the EU. And it would make the whole system less administrative and less bureaucratic and much faster. And I believe the current crisis showed us the importance of those aspects. And I'll just finish up. I know I'm a bit over time with the two important points at the end about the industries and how this is changing. There are two priorities in the EU now. On one side, we have the Green Deal and the green economy, which is definitely the path of the future for the EU, and all the new industries that are going to evolve as a result of that: energy efficiency, modern technologies, etc. The second part is, though, the industrialization in Europe and the goal now for Europe to return some of the more traditional basic industries, because the current crisis had shown us that we need to produce some of the basic materials here and not be relying only on third parties. So I think those two aspects should also be considered when we think about transforming the labor market. Thank you.
Fantastic, Svetlina. I actually think that on the digitalization, Casper will have a lot to tell us, and to also some best practices. Now that we've heard from politics, I actually would like to move to Sukti. So Sukti is the Chief of Employment, Labor Market and Youth Branch of the ILO in office in Geneva. I had to read it because I wanted to get it completely right. So Sukti, I actually would like to know from the ILO perspective. I know you've done some studies, you've done some surveys. How much has this pandemic really affected the employment, and especially the youth employment? Because in the end, we are talking about really the future of Europe, the young professionals, people that are finishing university now, and then they are starting their career. I think it's very important to understand how much this has affected it, and then what are the plans of the ILO to make sure that this is not going to be a real problem in the long-term future.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thanks to EU40 for organizing this event and for inviting the ILO. I think the discussion is very timely. I mean, the future of work has never been as important as it is right now, as we face really the far-reaching consequences of the coronavirus pandemic, as has already been outlined by the previous speaker. Let me contribute just 3 points to inform this debate, and we can discuss this further. First and foremost, the COVID-induced economic crisis, because the quarantine, as we all know, has led to huge repercussions. And I'm talking really from a global perspective right now, is having a devastating effect on labor markets, not only in Europe, but around the world. And young people and women are really badly hit. I mean, they always are hard hit during recessions, but this time even more so. And the latest ILO estimates from this week, we released the 5th monitor only 2 days ago, shows that working hour losses for the second quarter of 2020 relative to the last quarter of 2019 could be as much as 14% globally, of course, which is equivalent to almost 400 million full-time jobs. So, the scale is huge. And the impact on women, which also this monitor covered, is really disproportionate. And what we risk, and is actually very likely, is that many of the gains that we made on gender equality in the recent decades may retract. And young people are facing multiple shocks: education, training, transitions to the world of work having disrupted. They face job and income losses more than others, also a very deteriorating quality of employment. Now, to understand this fast evolving situation better, the ILO and the partners of the Global Initiative carried out this global survey of youth, which you already mentioned. The survey was mainly conducted in the month of May, and what we found is that of those surveyed, 1 in 6 young persons stopped working since the onset of the COVID-19 because of COVID-19. And half of the youth surveyed anticipate that their studies are going to be delayed, which will have implications for their careers and so on and so forth. And even more scary, I would say, is that 1 in 2 18 to 29-year-old is suffering from mental stress because of the current situation. Now that brings me to my second point, which is that we need now more than ever to have large-scale and targeted employment policy responses which link the immediate issues to the medium and longer term, while we all know that resources are terribly constrained for most countries, including the EU countries at this time. So we need to continue the strong counter-cyclical fiscal measures to support job retention and creation, and many of the issues that were already pointed out, to support enterprises and incomes. And indeed, many countries do have such stimulus packages in place. But at the same time, we have to boost investments in education, in training, especially because even though through the digital platform, we have reached many youth and many people have managed to continue working from home, there are many who are left out both from education and from work. And though the economic situation is bad, and there is always this temptation to dilute rights, we must not do so. I mean, from the ILO, I can only stress that we need to protect the rights of our workers, especially the youth, regardless of the types of contracts. And because also in the digital economy do often have very often precarious contracts. And this links to my third point, that is our recovery plans must lay the foundation for what we say is a better normal, not just a new normal. And to do so, we must harness the enormous potential of technological change and digitalization to create jobs, as well as retain jobs, and for social integration that digitalization offers. But we must also have systems in place to deal with some of the risks in the process. For example, as I already pointed out, many young workers may be pushed into more precarious forms of employment in the platform or gig economy. And they must have access to social protection. They must have access to rights. There needs to be adequate legislation on that. Mm-hmm. And we can indeed succeed if we work collectively and towards an inclusive social contract for what we in the ILO say a human-centered future of work post-pandemic, one that will be better. And social dialogue, including of youth representatives, is critical for this to happen. And it's for all of us to ensure that the outcomes post-pandemic are really fairer overall. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sukti. I think the picture that you've given us at the beginning is a bit scary, if you want, because you've given us some numbers that are not promising. But I also think that at the end, what you were mentioning is going to the right direction. And in this sense, I would like to ask Casper. So I know Microsoft is laying out a plan for this for the recovery that has to be digital, green, and inclusive, as you mentioned. So I would be curious to understand what does this entail, and how do you think that the digital part especially can help the young professionals?
Yeah, no, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak at an event for younger parliamentarians, although I am disappointed you didn't introduce me as being young, unlike some of the other panelists before, but I guess the gray hairs is sort of having their price these days. Anyway, listen, I'll make a couple of points on how we see the situation in Europe and what we've been trying to do to mitigate some of the dramatic consequences that other speakers have mentioned before. And then perhaps at the end, I'll say a few words about a fairly big initiative that we launched just a few days ago. If we look at the numbers, others have mentioned that this looks quite dramatic. I think we also have to realize that we're not at the end of the global pandemic, and there are still a lot of uncertainties on what the long-term consequences will be for the economy, unemployment, but I think both Sukti and Svetlina mentioned that the problem with the impact is that it's unevenly distributed. We look at the numbers, people working in in traditional areas or manual labor, they're much harder hit than other people. Women, it's crystal clear that they are harder hit than men, but also ethnic minorities across the world are generally being harder hit by unemployment rates right now. So I think one of the most important things that we need to do, and I think that's a shared responsibility between governments and the private sector, is we have to make sure that the recovery plans are indeed inclusive and that we make sure that everybody is on board in the bus. Representing a big technology player like Microsoft, we've been trying to do two things in response to this crisis. One of them is not unsimilar to what we're doing right now, and that is to use our technologies and our platforms to connect people. And it might not appear as being sort of rocket science, but I don't think one should underestimate the importance of us facilitating that people could continue working from home. We could continue supporting educations so that people at universities or high schools could continue with a relatively normal life during the pandemic. But we've also been involved in connecting healthcare workers. We've been involved in creating bots that reduces the sort of demands on doctors and nurses so they could focus on being with patients and giving optimal treatment. And I think that's sort of how we can use our technologies, Microsoft Teams, but also our AI systems, our machine learning systems, enabling researchers and scientists to hopefully use data to drive forward the better treatment and also eventually a vaccine for COVID-19. The other part of it is what I'll use 1 or 2 minutes on before shutting up here at the end, is really to look at what I think is one of the main topics for today's discussion. That is the evident necessity of upskilling digital competences. I mean, very little good has come out of the pandemic, but the only thing which might be helpful in the longer run is, of course, acceleration of digitalization, as both previous speakers also mentioned. Those that are more digitalized have been coping better during COVID-19, and even in the European Union, we know that there are major differences between the 27 member states in terms of how advanced societies are, how digital governments are, and even access to broadband is not evenly distributed across the board. But also in terms of digital skills, there is a massive gap in this area. And I just want to give you one indication of the data that we are looking at. If you take an advanced country like Germany, our expectation is that in 2025, just 5 years from now, there will be a shortfall of 2.5 million software developers. That's what we're hearing from the industry. And it just shows that upskilling people, including those who have lost their jobs, that are suffering because of COVID-19, that is a task that we have to invest a lot in. So 2 days ago, we sort of tried to show a bit of leadership here by launching a very big skilling initiative. The aim is to skill 25 million people across the world, focusing on 10 different areas that we think are critical: software developers, IT support functions, graphic designers. So areas that our data shows are in demand by companies, by the industry, by the public sector. And we're doing this free of charge. We are making available both Microsoft Learning, but also LinkedIn Learning, part of the Microsoft family, and also GitHub Learning. And the idea here is to try and do what we can. It won't solve all the problems, we realize that, but I think we are going to try and see connecting data with governments so we have a better indication of what is in demand, and can we help provide those skills and competences. The only thing I would mention just towards the end is I think that requires a shift of mindset also among policymakers, among governments, in acknowledging that education, lifelong learning is no longer just a prerogative of governments. I think we have to acknowledge that in responding to a very dramatic crisis, we need a multi-stakeholder approach where the private sector will also share the responsibility, and that's exactly what we've been trying to do. And of course, very happy to say some more words about this, but I think my time is up right now. So thanks for the first shot at this.
I'm sure on this one, Svetelina will have an answer very shortly. I would say that I called all of you by first name, so we're all young, and this is a very informal event. Just to respond to your first comment. So Thanos,
I'm not sure you're speaking the truth, but I appreciate the attempt. Thanks for that.
the attempt was good. I think it's interesting what you just said, and I'm curious to hear what Thanos has to say as Uber, as an international company. has taken some practices during the COVID. Uber is the example, I think, of the new kind of employment, if you want. It's something that people do not necessarily as a first occupation. So I'm curious to understand on your side, Thanos, how do you see this being affected by the COVID? And also maybe already responded to Sukti when she mentions that we shouldn't leave anyone behind, also when it comes to social rights and the rights of the workers.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Alessandro, and many thanks for everyone that spoke before me and shared all of their insights. One very quick comment on Casper's point. After 4 months being locked down, I think everyone is feeling rather old than young. So I think, again, we are on the same foot. Yeah. I will start with a comment of Sukti. This is absolutely essential. And this is something that we're also finding some difficulty in, as employment systems are designed having in mind an open-ended 9-to-5 type of job. And very often this is not what people that choose to work on platforms like Uber want. So there has been a discrepancy in trying to make sure that there are provisions and safety net for these people at the same time where the employment system in place and the rules in place are not made for them. In a nutshell, employment laws should cater for everyone and not focusing on people with certain employment statuses. That's sort of in one sentence. Going back to what Uber has learned through this process is that there were sort of holes in that safety net that was in place. So this is why we took immediate action, and we set up a financial assistance plan that sort of took care of drivers and couriers operating globally when they needed to quarantine or where they needed to self-isolate because of contracting the virus. And only in EMEA, I can share that we've already paid out more than 9 million euros to more than 30,000 drivers that had to self-quarantine or isolate. This is indicative of how the company is sort of changing its perception, and it comes on top of other initiatives that we have taken forward over the last years. Most notable one is the partnership with AXA, where we created, along with AXA, what we call the Partner Protection Program, which is essentially providing at no cost to people that drive or deliver with Uber in Europe a range of insurance coverage, including sickness, injury, maternity or paternity payments. And so far, it has already paid out more than the equivalent of 250,000 days of lost earnings. So these are, a couple of things that we have already been undertaking as we prioritize more and more the social protection aspect and wanting to make sure that the concerns of our partners are taken into consideration. What I also wanted to mention is that an essential part of the recovery is safety. We cannot open up again as long as COVID is still present without taking the necessary safety provisions. And this is something that will fuel recovery. If people are confident that they can go out there, they can move, they can go to their jobs, they will be able to commute, to consume more, and hence drive the economy, kickstart the economy again. So this has also been a big priority from our end. We've allocated $50 million globally, specific for the provision of personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies for driver and courier partners across the globe. And we've been collaborating with WHO, following its guidelines, following the guidelines of national health authorities to make sure that the information that is being provided to driver, couriers, and users alike is the most up-to-date and is taking into consideration the safety of everyone. The last thing I want to mention is how, in this context, Uber can be a solution. The economic challenges that are ahead and already present mean that Europe's workforce in general will need more, not fewer, opportunities to earn a living. This definitely, it should not come at the expense of an adequate safety net, but this is something that we can definitely be of help. In the past, we've seen from our driver and courier participation that in cities like Paris, 25% of drivers driving on Uber have been previously unemployed. 43% of which long-term unemployed. So there is a role for platforms like Uber to reintroduce people back into the labor market and to make sure that there are adequate safety provisions and adequate social provisions in place. And the very last thing, being mindful that I'm running over time, is we are aware that this might not be the end destination for a lot of people. So this might be only a stop. So we want to make sure that we provide solutions, education solutions, upskilling and reskilling solutions that fit to their needs. So we have struck a series of partnerships, notably with Open University in the UK or with Open Classrooms in France, where we have specific programs that are tailored to people that are using our app and are magnifying and enhancing the possibilities to take the next step. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thanos. I actually got from all your points quite of an interesting inputs. So just for all the people that are following us, both on Zoom and on YouTube, you can send in questions either via Twitter or in the Q&A here under. I would then start with the debate, and I would start with Svetlana, keeping in mind that any one of you that wants to jump in on something that someone else has said, just give me a notice and I will give you the floor. I would start with Svetlana and then with Sukti, because I think that both Kasper and Thanos have talked about how companies need to work on the upskilling. But what Kasper has mentioned on the differences in Europe is quite true also around the world. So I'm curious to understand, both of you, all of you actually come from different parts of Europe or work in different parts of Europe. I would be curious to understand how, Svetlana, in your case, how do you think that Bulgaria will react to this upskilling, and how can we really make sure that Europe goes and moves all together and not with like two driving seats, as someone said in the European Union?
Thank you, Alessandro. I'll start. I'll try to be brief so we have more questions and more participants can take part of the discussion. So first of all, before we start, I completely agree, because that's what we started with, upskilling, and the knowledge in the digital field is quite necessary. It has been proven, the new technologies are developing, and they're going to be a part of our future. But before we start thinking about the ways to upscale it, whether it's going to be through education or to like some extraordinary activities, it doesn't matter. We should be able to explain and probably to try to predict the professions of the future. And I think we've all touched upon that part in terms of like what are going to be the skills and the professions that you would need to have in the future. So we're definitely speaking about the digital and AI professionals. Like computing and engineering would definitely be needed. The green economy, as we've mentioned, we shouldn't be ignoring also sales, marketing, and content, which is also going to have different dimensions, probably with the changes of everything. In terms of like your specific question, like how is Bulgaria and other countries are going to react, I think Europe is quite fast in terms of adapting to new trends, so I'm not too worried about that part. In Bulgaria, specifically, the IT sector is one of the fastest growing industry in the country. So we have definitely we have the traditions in that field, and we have the professionals, and also in terms of the education we offer, it's quite a big part of that. So I think in terms of like how is it going to be equalized across Europe, I think Kasper basically brought up that point that it's different in different countries. I think we should be first, as I said, we should determine the skills that are going to be needed in the professions of the futures, and then start to look back what education we should be providing, because there is a bit danger again in the social aspect of what we have been observing so far. The e-learning had become like available quite quickly in a lot of countries in Europe, including in Bulgaria, both for university and school students. But the social aspect, like we shouldn't be allowing self-isolation and only letting the kids to be sitting in front of the screens and taking their lessons from home. So there is a balance that needs to be kept in terms of like, we shouldn't be going faster than the technology evolvement, if I can say that.
Thank you, Svetlana, for that. If someone wants to respond to that, by the way, to all the panelists, have a look at the Q&A because I already see a couple of questions. If anyone of you wants to take them, I think Svetlana actually hit the exact point. On one side, we need, of course, upskilling, but on the other side, we need also to think of what are the works and the jobs of the future. Like we are on the verge of a new digital revolution, and still like the broadcast or the internet connection is not equal everywhere. So Casper, on this side, how do you think the two things can go together? We live in a world where technology goes super fast but doesn't really reach everywhere.
And I think that's one of the big challenges of our time, to be honest with you. And you know, again, representing a big technology company, of course, we're interested in facilitating access to technologies, but not only for commercial reasons. We also think that this is almost a fundamental basic human rights in the 21st century. That if you don't have access to basic technologies, to you know, to the internet, then you are almost excluded from the society that we're developing these days. And again, I think that's sort of a shared responsibility between governments and the private sector, and that's what we're trying to address. I actually wanted to just comment on one thing that Svetlana mentioned before, sort of striking the right balance, which I think is absolutely correct. A couple of points on this one. I think we should not lose sight of the fact that it's not only the young generation that needs to be upskilled. When you look at the labor market today, and especially when you look at the people who have you know, very tragically lost their jobs, you know, these are people from all sectors, but even what you would consider sort of traditional industries or traditional more manual labor industries, you know, AI or ML or digitalization hits every single industry, every single sector. And therefore, I think we just have to get our minds around the fact that we need to upskill every single employee at different levels. We don't need everybody to be a software engineer or an AI expert, but I think we do need to acknowledge that most of our citizens will today have to have sort of basic IT skills in order to cope and be competitive on a global market. I want to, and I'm, you know, apologies, Alessandro, as I'm going to destroy the line of thought here, but I actually want to bring in one topic which I think is also very important when we look at the digitalization that is happening, and that is the question of cybersecurity. I mean, it's something we are extremely preoccupied with, because as we move the economy into this sort of hybrid economy where more and more people will be working from home, and I think we have to acknowledge that this is probably not going to disappear in the immediate future. We'll probably see societies opening and closing a little bit, unfortunately, which means that a lot of us will have to be able to work from home. But also, you know, companies, industries, small and medium-sized enterprises will increasingly go online. I think that's a fantastic opportunity, but it also increases vulnerabilities. So I think one of the aspects that will also have to be prioritized is cybersecurity. We have to make sure that we can have conversations in a secure way. We have to also ensure from a consumer point of view that privacy, fundamental human rights in accordance with European values will be upheld also in the 21st century, and also as we you know, are desperately trying to respond to COVID-19. So what I would say is that as part of our skilling initiative, we want to provide education to as many people as possible, but we also want to provide sort of the right education where we don't lose sight of, again, privacy issues or basic rights issues. And I think that's something where we also need sort of a pact between governments and industry. I saw in the chat that there was a question, how will Microsoft be working together with governments? And, you know, your timing of this event is impeccable, because, of course, yesterday the European Commission presented its new European skills agenda. And there is an element in that which is sort of a pact for skills. I'm not an expert on this, but our understanding is that that's almost a facilitation or a mechanism where you can connect you know, the public sector with the private sector, and enables the industry also to chip in with solutions. So I think that's the kind of innovation we will also have to look at in education. I think in response, that requires better accreditation systems. We need to make sure that we can provide people that are upgrading their skills also with certification, so that their new skills will be acknowledged by other companies, by governments as well. So I think promising development, but we're not there yet. So this will be a process that will have to be ongoing for quite a few months from here.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Casper, for that, and also for bringing in the security and the privacy of into the discussion. I think, Sukti, two things. First of all, I see there is one question on the chat which is asking how the ILO, if the ILO and how the ILO is involved in the European policy making. So on that side, I would ask you to comment, and also on something that both Svetlina and Thanos mentioned earlier, which is, everyone is talking then about safety and security. So how can we make sure that the people that are listening to us, young people around Europe, or even less young, we were discussing, it's not only a matter of young people. When we discuss about the future of jobs, we need to really reskill a lot of people that are of the older generation, let's say. So how can we make sure that all this falls in line with safety of having a job, that not while you're reskilling people, you actually lose your own job?
Yes, thank you, Alessandro, and thanks to Casper and Svetlina for the excellent points that you raised on digitalization and on the vulnerabilities in the process that might come about. Just wanted to add 2 points to that. One is that in addition to the vulnerabilities there, even in Europe, which is far better off than many other parts of the world when it comes to digitalization and access to digitalization, there are divides between countries, within countries. So if we are indeed going down this path, which is inevitable, I think post-pandemic, a lot of work, a lot of education is going to be online. We will need to find ways to reduce these disparities between countries and people, so that there are people who are not left out. But secondly, in addition to digital skills, there is a strong need for soft skills as well. For the future, and that's again, something that all countries will have to invest in. But just on the digital skills, I wanted to say that when it comes to access to digital skills, here I'm talking of Africa, the ITU and the ILO have launched a campaign on digital skills for young workers to reach 5 million by 2030, just in terms of access to basic digital skills, which is so important at this time, even for, let's say, all kinds of platform workers. In terms of what the ILO is doing in the European Union for policy making, or European countries, we are an agency which we work in terms of demands or requests that are made to us by our constituents. We are a tripartite organization. We work with governments, workers, and employers. And indeed, in the EU, we were working very closely with countries on the employment guarantee for youth employment guarantee, which I think has huge potential, which actually started in the context of the last crisis, but I think in the context of the present crisis too, and in the many ways that young people in the European Union are affected, there is a possibility and probably a good chance of gaining from this kind of employment guarantees, which were in the past. And the ILO is indeed working towards preliminary discussions on this with some countries. But we are also working in terms of doing rapid assessments. For example, we just completed one on Portugal. So we come in as and when we are requested to support our constituents, which are governments, workers, and employers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukti. Thanos, if you want to respond to what was said earlier, and also I would like to know, I mean, it's true that the future really is of even jobs that either are not existing today or that they will be transformed. And I assume that, when you were talking about the working hours, I see the working hours are changing drastically. I see it with myself under quarantine. I don't even know if it is day or night when I work sometimes. So I would like to know from your side, what is your take on this?
Many thanks. Very quickly to address something that Svetlana mentioned, especially on education, how there is a need to have a combination of online and offline, because the one feeds the other in order, especially on the educational side. And this is something that we also had in mind, and we recently partnered with UNESCO and join its Global Education Coalition. And as part of this sort of a collaboration, we are offering 1 million free rides to students and vulnerable families in order to visit UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which is essentially, you know, an added layer of the homeschooling that expands a bit the horizons. Going to a question that I also saw that we just received on essentially social protection for gig economy. It's something that I already mentioned. The pandemic showed, first of all, that this is not an issue of gig economy. This is not an issue of platforms. This is an issue, generally speaking, of self-employed people that are independent. Because the reality is that the social structure and benefit structure that exists in most of the countries in the European Union is structured for open-ended full-time employment. This is not the case for people that work on Uber, on Bolt, on Deliveroo, on other platforms. This is not the case for a lot of people that are self-employed or work part-time. So what we need to address is this systemic issue, how to make sure that no one is left behind. And what is very important is to make sure that when a company, in our case, Uber, takes action and does something on this regard, does not face, how to put it, legal uncertainty based on its actions. Because anything that Uber might do could jeopardize the independence of people that want to work on our app. To put it very bluntly, the main reason that people choose our app to work on it is because they can come and go whenever they please, and they can work as long as they want. There is no exclusivity, there is no commitment, there is nothing. So this is the big added advantage that essentially this model brings to the table. And that's why also there are jobs created and people can earn their living. If we were tomorrow to offer a series of things like the one that we do now with AXA, this is something that very easily can trigger what we call, you know, employment risks. This is something that if it's a danger for a platform like Uber, it's certainly a danger for platforms that are smaller than Uber. So there is a disincentive that is inherent to the models that are already built in place. That if someone who is not an employer offers something similar to what an employer would do, directly you consider them an employer. So there is room for reform, regulatory reform, and enabling actors like Uber to do more. Because I can guarantee you, I can tell you that it's not a matter of will at this point. Every platform wants to do more. Every platform is thinking the same way that I'm outlining. And at the end of the day, just to mention something that is not focusing on the societal part, but more on the business part, there is a business interest for platforms to attract platform workers. Like, it's a two-sided market. We need to attract clients and we need to attract business service providers. And we need to up our offer to attract these service providers. So, you know, the European Commission and the European Parliament might as well make it a race to the top among the platforms and let us compete on the basis of, you know, who is offering the most.
And on this note, I actually would like, thank you, Thanos, would like exactly to enter into this last part of our digital discussion. I am truly minded of time because I always promise that we will finish in an hour because people do not like to stay for too long. Everyone is busy. So I would like to take this last 15 minutes to give a question to all of you. And then, of course, Svetlana, if you can answer to what Thanos has just said. So my question for Svetlana, who is a member of the European Parliament, and for Sukti, which the ILO is an international organization that does also policy recommendation, is what can the industry do to help you to make sure that we can move forward after this pandemic, maybe even breaking some structures that were not good before, and how we can actually move for the better. And then the other way around, is for Casper and Thanos, what can policymakers do to make sure that you are able to do what you actually, I know I'm poking, I see Svetlina laughing, I know I'm poking, but I think that this is really the discussion. It's how we can all make sure that we build a multi-stakeholder platform that is able to work in the long run. So Svetlina, I give you the floor first.
Thank you, Alessandro. It's a very interesting twist to end the debate, and I think this is a needed conversation. So I'll start with a few comments on what has been said by the speakers so far, and then I'll be very brief. So in terms of the youth guarantee, youth employment guarantee, I just wanted to mention something that the EU is also doing currently. It's the so-called SURE mechanism, which supports unemployment risks in emergency situations like that, which is in the size of 100 billion euros grants that would be given to member states to help tackle the unemployment risks that are emerging in this situation, which we shouldn't be, I think it's a quite important thing we're doing at the moment. In terms of cybersecurity and the protection of our data all over those platforms, it have become very evident how needed is that, especially in the current situation. I just wanted to mention one update. The NIS directive would be reviewed again by the end of this year. So this is something which is also on top of our agendas. And now to the question, to final words, I guess, what the industry should do. I think we've more or less touched upon those points, and I'll divide the industry in probably two parts. One of them is like the startup unicorns or the new technological companies, and usually manage to adapt much faster to the new technologies and offer the new job opportunities and basically set up what skills they're looking for and train their employees. So, and the other parts are the big players, the big industrial companies that are probably especially hardly hit by the crisis now, or wouldn't be willing to invest much in training the employees or updating the technology. So what should the industry do? I would suggest, I would definitely say that the conversation between those two players in the economy is much needed at this point, because I think they can benefit from each other's experience and infrastructure. And the second thing is an active communication with us, because as we've seen now, the regulation would be starting to move much faster in certain areas which need to be regulated as a result of the pandemic. And of course, we're not expert in each one and every field. So raising the matters and helping us offer more pragmatic and realistic solution will definitely speed up the process a lot. So speak with the regulators more often and actually show where you see the pitfalls and the problematic areas.
And we are absolutely here for that, also to make this bridge. But I think that pragmatism, what Svetlina just said, is really something that we need to all keep in mind. Sukti, same question to you, and I would also add to answer one question that is in the chat. How we can make sure as well that that there are going to be enough jobs for everyone. That is a question that actually, as a young European, and I assume the person that is sending this question is as well quite young, we ask ourselves as well quite often. You are muted, Sukti. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. Yes, thanks. Let me take the last question first. And just to start by saying that, you know, before the pandemic, it's not as if things were great for young people. We did have a lot of labor market problems. And in fact, just before the pandemic, we launched, in fact, days before the pandemic hit Europe in a really big way, we launched the Global Employment Trends for Youth, in which one of the main points we're making was exactly this, that even when young people have the skills, they don't find the jobs. And one of the main findings of the report was that, you know, in the youth labor market, we find that inequality amongst youth wage earners has gone down. Normally, that should be a good thing. But when you delve more into it, you find that inequality is going down because the top part is being suppressed. Educated youth are earning less. And that's because there is a huge flood of educated youth in the labor market who are not finding jobs. So there is indeed a huge question about job creation, and you know, which is basically the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, not only skills development. And when it comes to job creation, your direct question to me on what industry can do really, fits in very well, because there is a huge role for, of course, all our partners. The government has a big role to play, but industry also has a major role to play in creating jobs, investing, in investing their profits in job creation. And in the context of the pandemic, we all have to see, all stakeholders together, how the economy can be stimulated, how workers can be protected, how enterprises can be supported, and all this based on social dialogue. But in particular, industry plays a very critical role in terms of strengthening occupational safety and health measures in the workplace, in adapting different work arrangements, which allows more flexibility, which we're already seeing a lot of industry doing. But also in terms of preventing discrimination and exclusion, because, as I was saying, when the economics get tough, then, many of these other issues get a kind of, are not paid the adequate attention. So industry needs to bear this in mind and, keep the focus on not allowing discrimination and exclusion to come in, provide health access, paid leave, etc. So there is a lot that industry is doing and industry can do, but it doesn't, it's a very grave situation, and it requires multiple partners. It requires all the stakeholders to be fully committed for us to actually come out of it. So it requires a collective effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukti. I love that elephants in the room come out always in the last 5 minutes of the conversation. But thank you for that, Sukti. Thanos, do you want to respond first to this?
Yeah, happy to. Just to echo what Sukti just mentioned about the importance of discrimination and how industry needs to take it into consideration and to be a very active partner to the local governments, and even initiate sometimes programs that are anti-discrimination. How the stakeholders can help. In a nutshell, like Svetlina already mentioned, a very big part. They can listen. Like this is already a very important aspect. Secondly, it's all about removing barriers. And when I mention removing barriers, it's not necessarily removing regulation. Sometimes a well-drafted regulation is removing a lot of barriers and is streamlining and enabling companies to do more. And I think this is what we have to have in mind, along with the bigger picture. Like we need to understand that things do not work in silos, and the social protection aspect or the earnings aspect of someone who is offering their services on Uber is going to be affected by what we call the licensing requirements to be a professional driver in that market. It's very important to have these aspects of supply and demand and the broader picture in our mind when we go about drafting legislation. And I think what COVID sort of demonstrated is that regardless of how to put it, the economy acts as a whole, and aspects of the economy are affected, and then everything is fluid, and the consequences are also fluid and stream down to every actor in the economy. So the bigger picture is very important thing to have in mind.
Thank you, Thanos. Casper?
I thought I was just taking notes on what the industry needed to do here. I also have to respond to that.
You actually can tell us also what the policymakers can do.
Yeah, listen, I'll provide a couple of comments. I think the first responsibility is to make sure that the crisis does not deepen more than absolutely necessary. So I think by providing and making our technologies available to governments, and let's face it, I mean, governments will be perhaps not the only show in town, but it will be a very important partner in responding to COVID-19, also in terms of providing revenues for basic services, supporting the industries that are suffering these days. So I think whatever we can do by making our technologies available, I think that's the first important step. The second thing, I don't want to repeat what we did with the skilling initiative, but I think that's how we are trying to contribute to the situation by saying we acknowledge that we need to help upskill people all over the world with the skills that we know are in demand. And I think the last bit is the important one, using data in a much more systematic way. So we're connecting people with skills with employers that are looking for the particular skill set. So I think that's where the data revolution is also finding its way into employment, to make sure that we train people, that we build competences that are in need by those that are seeking to employ people. And I mentioned a couple of numbers before on Germany. I would just recommend you to go in and use the different services we put online, because it is quite interesting to look at different categories of employment and how big the gap is between the number of people with those skill sets and what we expect will happen over the next couple of years. But I also want to say, sort of, I think Svetlina mentioned earlier before that if we look at the European Union, it's serious with potentially 56 million people unemployed because of COVID-19. On the other hand, I think also the European Union is showing a lot of leadership in identifying basically, the importance of digitalization, everything digital, but also the importance of going green in our recovery packages. And I think that's also an innovative approach in saying we don't necessarily need to rebuild the jobs that we had before. We also have to look towards the future. And I think sustainable jobs will be, in many ways, the future. And I think that's another area where the industry will have to come in and support what, in this case, the European Union will do. And then my final point is just to say, I think there is a misconception from time to time that the technology industry per se is against regulation. That is in fact not the case. In many areas, we welcome more regulation in areas that are complicated. Responsible artificial intelligence is an area that we are investing heavily in, but we also need to make sure that the guardrails will be set not by companies, but by those who create the policies. So I just wanted to sort of add in that I think regulation in key areas will be absolutely critical. And I'm a Microsoft employee, but I'm also European. So I just wanted to emphasize here towards the end that is an area where Europe is a superpower and where Europe is basically setting the guardrails for not only Europe, but in fact for the world. And I think that's something we should welcome, especially those of us that are very occupied with the values, the rights, the privacy aspects that are so fundamental here in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kasper. I saw Thanos nodding when you mentioned regulation, so great. Svetlina, one last comment, 1 minute, and then we close.
I'll try to finish on a positive note because I think we've all agreed on certain points. So this is not the first or the last crisis we're going through. Before the conversations, I was speaking with the colleagues here, and we couldn't agree if this is the fourth or the fifth industrial revolution because they've been defined differently already. So this is not the first nor the last time we're going through a period like that. It's important that we identify the jobs of the future because it's us who are going to be determining which ones are those, and start working together to educate and train the people to be prepared for that. And this is a responsibility equally for the regulators and for the industry, I believe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Svetlina. So I would like to thank all of you for being here on behalf of U40. It's really great to have this kind of conversation. The last bit that I would like to put there as a 30 years old European, I would say, please don't forget us. I mean, I think all of you have really laid down some good ideas. Really, I believe that the youth, and this is why we are the network of young members of the European Parliament, the youth is the future. So we need really to lay down policy and make sure that everyone is working towards a better future. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a lovely day. And hopefully we will have other times and occasions to do this kind of things.